Good morning to those of you joining us in the US, and good afternoon and good evening to those of you around the globe who are joining us today. We're really glad that you took the time to join us. I know it's a busy time for everyone, so thank you for joining us. For those of you who attended the first dialogue 2 weeks ago, welcome back. And for those of you joining us today for the first time, we're really glad to have you with us. We're really looking forward to the second dialogue focusing on sustainability and efficient trade. My name is Shari Rogge-Fidler, and I'm the president and CEO of Farm Foundation, located here in Oak Brook, Illinois. As this slide shows, Farm Foundation is an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, and our vision is to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. Our mission is really core to our dialogue today in terms of building trust and understanding at the intersections of ag and society. And we accomplish this in a variety of ways, including objective dialogue, such as we'll be having today. If you haven't looked at our website, please do, or follow us on social media noted here. If you do want to tweet today, we ask you to use the hashtag #AgTrade noted in the lower left-hand corner of this slide. There are just a few housekeeping items I'd like to go over today, and most of these will be familiar to those of you who have participated in Zoom sessions like this before. But if you have any trouble during the session, if you give it a little time, we usually settle into things. Zoom balances out. We will be taking Q&A today during the Q&A button that you can note in the bottom middle part of your screen. And if you have any connectivity issues, like I said, they'll try to take care of themselves. You can also use the chat function to ask for help. And again, hashtag #AgTrade for the hashtag today. So for this morning's dialogue, we will be hearing a few welcoming remarks from Chantelle Donahue, who's chair of the board of directors of Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, our partner in this dialogue series, followed by our moderator, Urban Lehner, chair of the International Crane Foundation, as well as our wonderful panel of experts that you'll be hearing from soon, who will discuss each of their unique perspectives. We'll also have time, as I mentioned, for Q&A from all of you. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Chantelle.
Well, thank you, Shari, and thanks for setting the stage for the dialogue today. So just a quick overview of CAPI. CAPI is a place for agri-food leaders to come together, share insights, and advance ideas on emerging issues facing this important sector. CAPI's work reflects systems thinking, researching complex and interconnected food issues, bringing diverse voices to the table from across the agri-food supply chains, governments, researchers, and among adjacent sectors. So with that, Shari, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. We're just thrilled to have this partnership with CAPI at a time of great uncertainty, really, for our countries and around the globe. And we really look forward to an open, robust discussion today. So just as a reminder, you can submit questions anytime throughout our time together today, and then we'll compile those and address those towards the end of our portion of our dialogue series today. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Urban Lehner, the board chair of International Crane Foundation, and perhaps more importantly to us here at Farm Foundation, a longtime friend of Farm Foundation through our roundtable program. So Urban, over to you.
Thank you, Shari. And thank you all of everyone for joining us today for the second dialogue in this series, Managing Agricultural Trade in an Increasingly Chaotic World. My background is rooted in 50 years of journalism at DTN, the Progressive Farmer, the Wall Street Journal, and the Asian Wall Street Journal. I've spent a good deal of my career covering trade. I have deep connections to agriculture, and I have a deep passion for conservation. In today's dialogue, we're going to talk about the intersection of these things that have shaped my life, how trade can play a role in promoting both economic efficiency in agriculture and environmental sustainability. I'm sure you're all as eager to hear as I am what our panelists have to say about this. Our panelists include Rory McAlpine, Bill Bryant, and Mac Marshall. We're going to start by hearing from Rory McAlpine, Senior Vice President, Government Relations at Maple Leaf Foods. Take it away, Rory. Rory, you have to unmute.
Got it. Okay. So thank you very much, Urban. It's certainly a pleasure to join this dialogue. I'm a relatively new member of the board of CAPI, but I come to this discussion with a career in government and industry, and much of it has centered around agri-food trade issues. So maybe what I can best do is convey not the big and the theoretical so much as give you a perspective that's obviously more commercial and more business focused, representing a company. So what I wanted to do was really address in 10 minutes or so, basically 4 questions. The first would be, I do want to give you a bit of an update. What is, or who is Maple Leaf Foods, and why does this whole issue of sustainability particularly matter to us? Then what are our sustainability goals? Then what are the risks to taking this position, this overt position on sustainability to our business? And then finally, where are the opportunities? And maybe that's where I can talk a bit about sort of that global trade context and the issue of trade agreements and how it matters to a company like ours, which is active, particularly on both sides of the Canada-US border. So firstly, Maple Leaf is a $3.9 billion revenue business. We have 13,000 people, over 22 plants in animal and plant protein with several leading brands in North America. Our roots are very much in animal agriculture and meat, but we have forged into the space of plant-based protein in the last 2 or 3 years with some significant growth potential. But we have a philosophy, a corporate strategy that is rooted in the catchphrase, raise the good in food. And why this matters is that we see ourselves as a shared value company. So we approach this not just from a narrow commercial perspective, but one where we believe there's shared value in a sustainability approach that incorporates the interests not just of our company, our employees, our shareholders, but also the full stakeholder community that we're connected to. In fact, I'll quote Michael Porter. He said, shared value is not social responsibility, philanthropy, or sustainability, but a new way for companies to achieve economic success. And the path of shared value finds opportunity in the intersection between the needs of society and the unique capabilities of the business to create value for all stakeholders. So we believe that quite profoundly. And we put this into action through what we call a blueprint, which is a whole series of activities and actions that you might find surprising for a corporate interest. These are issues that extend everywhere from our actions on food security and our partnership with many food security organizations, to what we're doing in animal care, to, of course, all of our environmental related commitments. So what are our sustainability goals? Well, you know, we start, I guess, from the understanding that we do have a significant sustainability challenge in agri-food, and not least of all in animal agriculture and meat production. Both meat production and consumption faces a revolution in many ways because of the challenges associated with sustainability. And our view is that, you know, we don't want to be a passive player in this. We want to lead, we want to leverage. We started that journey years back with, for example, leading North American production of raised without antibiotics animals in poultry and pork. We have a North American leading action plan on animal care, and so on. But we also began to embrace the reality that there's a problem with meat consumption and production in terms of sustainability impact. We know that, I think the latest data would suggest the food system as a whole contributes about 26% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, and we have to find a path to bring that down. We literally adopted the view that it's appropriate, yes, to eat meat, but you should eat meat in moderation. That's a pretty radical statement for a company that's got 100 years of history in meat production and promoting its consumption, and that we have to fix some of the things that aren't good about the system. We have to move more from, you know, a position of contributor to the problem to finding significant solutions. And we think we as one company have the path to do that. So what we did particularly, we declared that we would be carbon neutral. We did this last year, and that means immediately. It's not an aspirational goal, it's now, as soon as we announced this last fall. And we did this on the basis of the understanding that the path to carbon neutrality is about avoid, it's about reduce, it's about replace, and it's about offset. There's a cascade of actions that we're taking to be able to declare this. Before we went there, we had already agreed that we would cut our carbon footprint, our carbon emissions by 50% by 2025. But now we are one of only 290 companies globally that have embraced the science-based targets for all our scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions to achieve that by 2030. So I won't go into the whole background of that, but the important thing to understand, this is not an intensity-based target. This is an absolute reduction. So regardless of how the company may grow, how production may increase, how sales may increase, we are committed to an absolute reduction as measured in accordance with the science-based targets established globally. And to get there, of course, in the near term, we've purchased offsets. So we've done a number of things internally, but to get to the immediate goal of carbon neutral, last year we purchased 10 high-quality offset projects or credits through offsets in North American projects of high integrity and validation. And we also believe, though, that there's real advantage. For example, already we have received interest rate benefits on our credit facilities because we have declared a position of carbon neutrality. We also, though, of course, believe we can aggressively market our position in on carbon action through consumer labeling. I don't know if folks saw a couple days ago in Forbes, they talked about the whole new issue of carbon labels. You know, we're very familiar with nutrition labels on food, but there's starting to be companies, and we're going to be one, where we will declare the carbon position associated with the production and consumption of a given food product. And while we're not at all pricing for that in our model at this point, we believe we can margin our products, we can gain market share because the consumer interest is real and it's growing, and we have a strong science basis to validate the carbon associated with any given production in our system. And we also believe, though, we can monetize our carbon mitigation through our own offsets, both perhaps certainly to meet our compliance obligations, because of course, at least in Canada, there is carbon pricing. And there's both national and provincial carbon pricing. It depends on the jurisdiction. But we want to, through our own mitigation efforts, earn credits that then can be applied against the compliance obligations. And who knows, in the future, literally, we might be able to take projects, for example, related to manure management in our system that would earn credits that literally we could sell in carbon markets. So what are the risks to this? Well, there is, let me put it this way. I think there's risks. There's risks to inaction and there's risks to action. There are risks to inaction. We know that the planet is warming, that there's a lot of compromise to soil quality, to water, to biodiversity beyond just the greenhouse gas issue. And we are eroding natural capital in many parts of the world. We think Canada is actually better positioned than many other countries because of the abundance of natural capital and the generally sustainable rate at which water and soil is depleted or managed. There's an issue, obviously, to global food security. And there's even a risk, I think, in all of this to public and animal health. We see from COVID-19 that whole intersection of health and how climate is affecting the dispersion of disease risks and risk factors in health. And, all of these factors basically say, as a system, not only is it the right thing to do, it's necessary because there's a real risk to our business viability. For example, the spread of foreign animal disease is profoundly impactful, and that's all connected to sustainability goals. And to our business, the very viability of our supply chain that comes from inaction related to climate impact and compromise to our water quality, even grain quality. The quality of grain that feeds the pig that goes into our process can be impacted. And there's a risk of losing social license, right? We all know that failing to act is we're going to lose our consumers, we're going to lose our own employees. Many of our employees want to only work for a company that's clearly committed to sustainability goals, particularly carbon management. Our investors, our regulators, these are all people that matter to a publicly traded company like ours, so we feel we have to act. But there is risk to taking action, right? There's real risk. There's cost, right? We can't deny it. There's real cost. It's hard to price for the externalities associated with our methods of production. Will consumers pay? We're taking a position right now, we're not going to try to price this in, but over time, there's going to have to be a return on these kinds of investments. And the problem, of course, in the trade context is if Canada, if companies like ours take on more cost, are we going to be competitive relative to our global competitors? And one of the major issues here I will call out is that these interjurisdictional differences, like the idea that just even within Canada, we've got different provinces regulating and pricing carbon differently. We've got in Canada as a whole, carbon pricing that is not mimicked in the US, and yet we have to compete on a cross-border basis. And what is the consequence then for those compliance costs, the trade barriers that could be a consequence of that? And of course, we can see, we've seen this in the past where these kinds of measures can be embedded in protectionism, where some jurisdictions, frankly, Canada could say to the US, well, look, we're going to start applying a carbon tax to all imports of US food products into Canada. That would be hugely disruptive to the trading relationship. And don't worry, it's not about to happen, but that's the kind of issue. The final question then, though, what are the opportunities? And for us as a business, there are both domestic and international opportunities. First, as I say, it's meeting consumer expectations, driving volume, value, margin opportunity, moving beyond a commodity pricing mindset as we take on this positioning. We believe, as I said earlier, we can monetize some of our carbon reduction efforts. The carbon farming idea, we've become quite interested in the Teraton initiative. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with the whole carbon farming model and the monetization of regenerative agriculture in crop production across North America. That's the kind of thing we can do. And I would also point out, it's easy to talk about this only in terms of government regulation and trade agreements and how do we reconcile the trade objective with sustainability goals. What's important to remember is that there's a lot moving in this space that has nothing to do with government action. I'm thinking of, for example, the Consumer Goods Forum globally. National or global standards that are being set for supply chains in the private sector for sustainability that have nothing to do with anything being mandated by government. And so, for example, we as a supplier to a major food retailer in Canada or in the US, if that retailer adopts, say, the Consumer Goods Forum standards for packaging waste or for greenhouse gas mitigation, you better believe we will respond. We have to. They're our customer. It's not about what the government in that jurisdiction may demand, it's our customer. And so a lot of this is being driven by the expectations of the Walmarts of the world, of the major retailers. And so that's why it matters, and it's happening cross borders, right? This is happening globally, and we have to be in tune with that. For the broader sector, there's a risk, of course, that standards can be problematic, but I think there's a history, and I'll end on this point, that if trade agreements, be they bilateral, regional, multilateral, of course, have raised the bar through provisions on labor, on environment, on SPS standards, food safety, animal health. The idea that somehow a trade agreement drives a race to the bottom, I don't believe is proven out. I think you can see that not only do trade agreements enhance wealth creation globally, which allows for investment in higher safety and environmental standards, it also helps everybody based on trade rules come to compliance, of course, to science-based non-trade or least trade restrictive measures. That's what a modern trade agreement achieves. And so I think sustainability, including carbon pricing and carbon management, can similarly follow a path of globalization, of global standardization, supported by trade agreements. The two do not need to be at odds with each other. Basically, we have to reduce the regulatory distance between countries on this issue. And we of course, also need to drive program standards In the case of the WTO, through domestic support that would recognize investments in sustainability that are compatible with trade obligations, but we believe it's possible. And it's necessary because the world's getting smaller, the sustainability risks aren't going away, and commercial interests like ours want to and have to play in this game because the world is moving, our customers are moving, our employees are moving, our investors are moving, and now's the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rory. That was fascinating. I'm sure you'll get a lot of questions. A reminder about questions that you can submit them at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And next up, we have Bill Bryant. Bill is the founder and chairman of Bryant Christie, Inc. Bill, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you, Rory. That was an excellent job. Rory, really, I think you did a fine job laying this out from a commercial point of view. What I've been asked to do is to build on what Rory just said and talk about how we can approach this from a policy perspective. And I really appreciate this opportunity. About, I don't know, I was going to say a few months ago, but now it seems like a lifetime ago, Shari and Don, when we all met in DC, back when we jumped on planes and went places, but I guess that was last fall, it seems years ago. But we, at this time, a small group of us talked about how the multilateral trading system needed to evolve beyond where it is right now, because it's clearly not working. And today, I think, provides an opportunity to continue that conversation and really propose one way the trading system can move forward in a manner that increases environmental protection and strengthens the stability of the sustainability of the supply chain, and also at the same time increases support for trade. And the real answer for that, and Rory has already laid it out, is that we've got to reduce the regulatory differences within countries or between countries. And today I'd like to talk about why we should do that, why it's good for the international food supply chain, and then throw out some ideas on how we do it, and how we do it in a way that increases support for trade agreements and for trade. For those of you who don't know me, and that's probably just about everybody, let me say that up front, I am an environmentalist. I'm a defender of public lands. I'm a Republican who believes that humans are accelerating climate change and that we need a planetary response. Right now, I only serve on 2 nonprofit boards, and both of them are focused on environmental protection, habitat restoration, and getting people outdoors. I've also spent the last 38 years increasing international trade in food and agricultural products. My company, BCI, eliminates trade barriers around the world for companies and producer organizations. We work on increasing regulatory harmonization so that the supply chain can move efficiently. And my passions for trade and the environment really merged in 1999 at the WTO Ministerial that was held in Seattle. If any of you remember that, it was supposed to launch what would have become the Seattle Round, which didn't quite work out that way. But at that ministerial 21 years ago, I chaired the non-governmental organization, or the NGO committee. So I was responsible for coordinating the needs and the activities of all the NGOs, whether they were labor or representing the rights of indigenous peoples, or in the environment, business, all of the NGOs. But the ones that were most present during that ministerial were environmental NGOs from around the world. And when dealing with those groups, I tried to clarify that the WTO was really agnostic on the environment, and that it should stay that way. I really thought that trade agreements were for trade and environmental agreements were for the environment, and that it should stay that way. Many in the environmental community didn't think the WTO was agnostic on trade. They would cite cases where the WTO had found laws designed to protect turtles and dolphins to contradict WTO obligations and would require governments to revise those laws. And so they saw the WTO as really a mechanism of undermining environmental protections. And they wanted the WTO to include environmental protections in trade agreements. I argued at the time that trying to insert environmental language into trade agreements was an awkward way of securing environmental objectives, and that it would only complicate getting a trade agreement. 21 years later, I'll say I wasn't entirely wrong, but I've come to appreciate that I wasn't right either. Today, including environmental chapters facilitates concluding a trade agreement. And not having environmental language could jeopardize the approval and the popular support for that agreement. And resisting environmental concerns being integrated into a WTO framework, I think actually will prevent the evolution of the WTO and our trading system in a way that we were all trying to figure out how it could evolve. So to facilitate trade agreements and to support the needed evolution in our multilateral trading system, I am totally open to inserting sustainability language into our trade agreements. There are 4 other policy reasons or other just reasons that I'm open to this in a way that I wasn't maybe a decade or 2 ago. The first is that including environment in multilateral trade agreements is more likely to be successful today than it was when we were talking or debating this in Seattle over 21 years ago. Today, there are more countries that have the technical capacity and the public support to engage in environmental protection in a way that they didn't then. And that is a direct result of new middle classes around the world who are demanding clean air and water, who are demanding safe food, who want action on climate change, and who support sustainable production and packaging policies. Those new middle classes that are demanding these policies, by the way, came into being because of the wealth and the growth that was generated by trade liberalization over the last several decades. The second reason I'm more open to including environmental concerns in trade agreements is that the nature of our environmental challenges have evolved as well. If we're going to successfully address carbon emissions or the relationship between climate change and food security, or if we're going to talk about how we reduce plastic pollutions in our oceans, we are going to have multilateral cooperation. And most likely, effective policies are not going to be able to be divorced from production policies. That means that if we're going to really deal with these new environmental measures in a multilateral way, and if we're going to do it in a way that doesn't create the same kind of problems we had, which were production policy related problems with tuna, dolphin, and turtles, the 2 issues that were thrown around so much 20 years ago, then there has got to be some multilateral agreement on best practices and standards, and those should be included in trade agreements. The third, not melding trade and environmental concerns really could undermine support for international trade at a time when we do not need to undermine support for international trade any more than it already is. In the absence of a multilateral agreement on best practices and production standards, emerging environmental issues are going to continue to dominate the discussion, and that's going to cause countries to go in their own ways, developing their own tactics, requiring specific production practices that are going to impose unique taxes and costs on producers. Rory mentioned this, it has the potential, as countries move off in their own way on these environmental measures and begin regulating production practices, it has the very real potential of putting their own producers at a competitive disadvantage in the marketplace. And that could end up reducing or minimizing or undermining support for the environmental measure, and also increasing support for protectionist policies against imports. And neither of those are the direction we want to go. And finally, the fourth reason for including environmental provisions in trade agreements is a reason that really didn't exist 20 years ago. And that is globally, and this is particularly true in our food system, globally, supply chains are much more integrated than they were a few decades ago. A system in which different components of a product are produced in different countries, each subject to different production standards, is not desirable in a system where we are trying to efficiently produce goods in multiple countries and then move them around the planet. So I've I've tempered my purity of 1999 and believe that in order to move forward on certain environmental issues in a very meaningful way, and in order to strengthen support for the multilateral trading system and for international trade generally among the public, and in order to facilitate supply chain management in an environmentally sustainable fashion, we need to explore under which circumstances we should include environmental measures in trade agreements. Now, this isn't really, and Rory kind of pointed out some examples of how his own company is moving forward in this. This is not really breaking new ground. I mean, it might cause some people on a bunch of trade wonks to gasp, but in the real world, it's not really breaking new ground. And maybe not even within the trade community, because there are investment chapters in some FTAs that already include language that promotes sustainable development. And increasingly, there are even full chapters on the environment in bilateral and regional trade agreements. And I'm not just talking about those that the United States has been involved in. China has concluded trade agreements with both Switzerland and Chile, and they both include environmental chapters. And across the globe, there are calls for negotiating new environmental chapters in existing free trade agreements that don't have environmental language. For example, since signing the Sino-Peru free trade agreement in 2009, China has invested heavily in Peru's oil, gas, and mineral sectors, and in some cases are extracting huge amounts of resources in incredibly biodiverse areas of Peru. And this has given rise within Peru for calling for a negotiation of new environmental chapters or a environmental chapter in the existing Peru-China free trade agreement. The two examples that we have, the biggest examples of environmental language in an existing trade agreement, are really the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the most recent revisions to the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I want to review real quickly what the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Nafta revisions have included, because I think that they can provide a foundation upon which we can build in a much more multilateral way. And when you're looking at the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the environmental chapters, there's really 7 points that we need to keep in the back of our mind. First is that there's a standstill provision, which means that you can't roll back your environmental standards. You're committing to maintaining the level of protection for the environment that you have on the day that you signed the agreement. The second, there is language that protects endangered species, and it particularly cites the CITES Treaty on the International Trade of Endangered Species. Third, there is, I think, maybe for the first time in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for the first time in a trade agreement, or at least certainly a major regional trade agreement, includes language on sustainable fishing practices. And it restricts subsidies, it promotes fishery management systems, and it also includes bycatch restrictions. And those are intended to protect bycatch of sharks, whales, dolphins, sea turtles, birds, and other marine species. It requires information sharing to prevent illegal logging. It has limits on ozone depleting substances and cites the Montreal Protocol. It restates obligations under the International Convention on the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, which those, I've worked a lot on marine trafficking, and the MARPOL is the treaty which deals with marine pollution from ocean-going vessels. And finally, it has provisions that eliminates tariffs on green products such as wind turbines. The one thing which is important, I think, for the Trans-Pacific Partnership is it specifically cites different international agreements, CITES on endangered species, the Montreal Protocol on ozone, and the Convention on MARPOL, or marine pollution. The other example, and actually the most recent example of a successful inclusion of environmental language, would be the updating of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And in many cases, the updates of the environmental chapters and language borrows and builds upon the language in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you run through what is the updates in the US, Mexico, Canada updates to NAFTA, again, standstill. We're not going to roll back from the date that we signed the agreement. We're only going to move forward on environmental regulations. It doesn't just cite CITES and the Montreal Protocol and MARPOL as the Trans-Pacific Partnership does, but it also cites the Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Protection, and the International Convention on the Regulation of Whaling. So it expands the other international environmental agreements that have already been negotiated, expands the scope of which they will be referred to in a trade agreement. It has language on air quality and marine litter, specifically plastics. Again, language on fisheries management, forest management, and it provides for, and I think this is important, a formal mechanism for environmental cooperation between the three countries. So if you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and you look at the updates to Nafta, and you're thinking about, okay, how can we begin to move the trading system in a way that it will become more sustainable and there's a more concrete relationship between trade and environmental agreements? These two agreements really provide the foundation of an agenda. That would be the protection of endangered species, ozone depletion, marine pollution, wetlands protection, Arctic protection, whaling and fisheries, and tariffs on green products. That's a very solid, largely already regionally accepted, multilaterally accepted agenda of items that we could include in the trade agreement. And to varying degrees, there's acceptance, one, that these are the most important, or not the most, but the ones that we can agree on right now, issues. And also there is some agreement on how we need to move forward. But the most recent difficulties on trying to negotiate an agreement on fisheries in the WTO makes it very clear that even if we have an agreement that these are the issues we need to be focusing on, getting an agreement on what we do about them is not always easy. Taking the existing agreements and putting them into a trade agreement, as was done with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Nafta, is probably the easiest and the most straightforward way of putting trade into, our environment into a trade agreement. But the heavy lifting is really going to come, and maybe some of the more meaningful progress is going to come, and our ability to help the WTO evolve so it stays relevant is going to come when we start trying to insert emerging environmental issues. And these are the ones where there is no pre-negotiated environmental agreement just to stick into the trade agreement. But these are going to be new emerging environmental issues that have trade implications and can affect the supply chain, and therefore I think need to be addressed in some way within the WTO framework. One example, I'll give you a few. One example would be plastics. There are restrictions on plastic packagings being developed across the United States and the European Union, and most recently Germany just voted to implement this. There will be a ban on single-use plastics by 2021, which is not that far away. And the European Union has stated that they must collect 90% of the plastic bottles by 2029, which is going to severely restrict the use of plastic bottles. Now, these are not measures intended to restrict trade. They're intended to reduce plastics in landfill and on our beaches. But in the absence of any international agreement, supply chains involving the production of products that use plastics or that are packaged in plastics, whether produced in Europe and then exported or produced outside Europe and then sold there, there's going to be some disruption in those production practices and supply chains. International cooperation, dealing with plastics within a WTO framework, specifically if they're dealing with requirements on production practices, is a way we might be able to avoid that. The other area where, in the absence of some multilateral coordination, environmental policies could complicate trade and put some producers at a competitive disadvantage, and Rory already alluded to this, and it's one we cannot ignore, is carbon emissions. And it is going to directly affect the production of food around the planet, how we deal with carbon emissions, and the integrity or the efficiency of our supply chains as the global food supply. In the absence of any coordination on best practices and standards and production methods and incentives, all dealing with carbon emissions, different countries are going to move forward with their own regulations, as Rory indicated, their own labeling requirements, their own taxes and incentives and investment arrangements. Now, the problem with that is really twofold. First, in isolation, just one country going off and doing its own thing, regardless of how well-intentioned. In isolation, these policies are unlikely to have any real impact on the planet's climate. But they could put their own producers at a competitive disadvantage. And that, again, I fear is going to run the risk of having an environmental measure which isn't getting the job done, and so it will undermine support for moving forward on the environmental issue. And because you put your own producers at a competitive disadvantage, it could undermine support for trade. To avoid that, one approach might be to just first negotiate a meaningful agreement on carbon and how we're going to regulate or label it, and then put that into some sort of existing WTO framework. And that seems very straightforward, but it will be incredibly difficult to do. But that is the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Nafta model, is that you negotiate an environmental agreement, then you stick the pre-negotiated environmental agreement into a trade agreement. The problem with trying to do that here with a big issue, we're seeing that with fisheries, but also with plastics or with carbon, is that not all WTO members are ready to move forward on some of these issues. And they might oppose including such issues or even an agreement on such issues into the overall WTO framework. So when we want to move forward on something, whether it's fishery subsidies or whether it's labeling of food products with their carbon footprint or the use of plastics, how do we do that? How do we move forward in a meaningful way on these environmental measures when there's a significant number of countries in the WTO that don't want to move forward or don't really seriously want to negotiate an agreement? How do we create a system, a multilateral trading system, that allows us to both improve our environment and actually helps move the WTO and the trading system to a more evolved or new level? And how do you do that when you don't have all members wanting to move forward, and when you have a system that requires consensus of all members? You can't. So we're going to have to come up with a new structure, one that allows for different countries to be in different places and have different interests at the same time without holding back those countries that want to move forward, and figuring out a way that those countries that want to move forward can do so without putting their own producers at a competitive disadvantage, undermining support, possibly undermining support for trade. And I've come up with a proposal that I'm going to throw out today on how we can maybe pull all this together and do it within a WTO framework. And I suggest that we create a hard core with concentric circles of obligation within the WTO. The outside circle, which you're seeing on your screen right now, would just be the existing WTO commitments and tariff bindings, the WTO as we know it. And countries could have already, with the Uruguay round and subsequent agreements, signed up for those existing obligations. The second circle would weave together the environmental obligations and standards of existing bilateral and regional free trade agreements. There can be no rollback. Most of these agreements, as I point out, they're standstill language. You can't go backwards. So this circle must include the most rigorous environmental measures already included in a regional or bilateral free trade agreement. In exchange for adopting these additional commitments, members would be entitled to a deeper level of trade liberalization. And in the center would be a hard core. And members agreeing to be part of this hard core would agree to address emerging environmental issues before they become trade disputes. This hard core would commit to a process, would not necessarily negotiate specific standards, but it would commit to a process. It would include mechanisms for harmonization of standards, the mutual recognition of production practices, and joint scientific reviews prior to domestic policymaking. Now, some people might think that that's just absolutely crazy and impossible. It's not going to be easy, but current global cooperation on food safety and internationally regulating pesticide use, which is already being done and has been for decades, is an example on how this could work. For years, I served on the US delegation to the Codex Alimentarius Committee on Pesticide Residues, which has got the wonderful name CCPR. And the CCPR, the Codex Committee on Pesticide Residues, sets global maximum residues for the safe presence of pesticides in food products. Now, under the original rules, and when I got on the committee, the committee could not evaluate a new chemical that was coming on the market. It could not set a standard, an international standard for the residue of that chemical or that pesticide until a member country had already evaluated that chemical safety and set their own domestic standard. Only then, after it had a domestic standard, could the Codex Committee schedule a review, request data from multiple countries, and after many years, propose an international standard for that chemical. Now, this created a few problems. One, since only chemicals that already had a tolerance in one country qualified for a global review, chemicals were already being used on food and were already, that residues of that chemical were already moving through the food supply before there was an international standard. And that created import compliance problems that were not necessarily related to health issues, but were simply the result of one chemical having a standard that did not yet have an international standard, and therefore some countries without an international standard to defer to simply rejected the importation of that product. To avoid that, some chemical companies would actually hold back introducing a new chemical or pesticide until it was registered in multiple countries. But that actually delayed the introduction of newer, safer compounds, which is something we didn't want. And then additionally, countries that were conducting their own evaluations using their own data, their own evaluation methods, would understandably come to sometimes very different conclusions, and then were extremely reluctant, and I'm being diplomatic, to revise their domestic standard once an international standard was set. So the solution we implemented was for multiple countries within the Codex framework to look at an emerging chemical compound simultaneously and jointly, and to use the same data and to share data and to use the same evaluation methods and to share their findings as their review went along. And our aspiration was that if scientists used the same data set and reviewed the data jointly and shared their findings as they developed them, they would most likely come to compatible, if not the same, conclusion. And with compatible standards set domestically in multiple countries at about the same time, trade tensions were minimized, largely eliminated altogether, certainly manageable within a supply chain operation. And then securing the needed international standard was accelerated. Now, that is a process that we could put at the hardcore and apply to some of these emerging environmental issues, whether it is continued relationship between climate change and food security, or the use of plastics, or labeling. And importantly, this process through the Codex is already directly included in the WTO agreements. So joint reviews, harmonization, mutual recognition could help countries in the hardcore develop sustainable production practices in a way that promotes sustainability, minimizes disputes, and facilitates supply chain management. And if we can figure out how to do that, we can blend environmental policies and trade agreements seamlessly. It's ambitious. There's a lot of winds blasting us in entirely the opposite direction. But I would put to you that those a few generations ago who gathered in Bretton Woods or in Havana when they were negotiating and setting up the general agreement on tariffs and trade didn't really charge themselves with developing incremental steps. They imagined a trading system that would work for a new world and for the world they want to live in. And I think that we should be no less ambitious. And this is one way I think we could merge sustainable practices and production practices and international trade without creating some of the trade agreements that or trade disputes that we have in the past.
Thank you, Bill. That was very informative and very thought-provoking. And I especially enjoyed the description of the evolution of your thinking over 21 years and your intriguing suggestion for a way forward. I'd like to introduce now our final speaker, Mac Marshall, Vice President, Market Intelligence for the United Soybean Board. Mac works with the Soybean Board's leadership to evaluate and establish long-term strategic initiatives in support of advancing domestic and international market opportunities for the U.S. soybean industry. Mac?
Thank you very much, Urban, and thank you both to Cappy and the Farm Foundation. It is a true pleasure and honor to be a part of this panel, though I will say you've made it rather challenging having me follow some excellent presentations and comments by both Rory and Bill here. So just to give a little more context on my background and the work that we do at USB, United Soybean Board. So first and foremost, what we strive to do is ultimately deliver value back to US farmers through looking for new and novel, as well as growing existing market opportunities for US soy, both domestically and abroad. Now, I come to USB after a number of years in both government and industry. I started at USB about 2 months ago, and prior to that had worked at Monsanto and Bayer, both in the fields of corporate strategy and working on global market access issues. I'm an economist by trade, both spanning my time in public service and my time in industry. So I'd be remiss if I didn't include a couple graphics and visuals in my presentation here. So with that, I'd like to pivot to this next slide to give the audience a little bit of context just on how critical international trade is for the industry that I work in and delivering value back to the US soy industry. So if we look at the table on the left here, we look at global soybean consumption over a long continuum of time, over the past 20 years. And you can see just how much demand has grown over this time. But one thing that I think that really jumps out is just how much of that demand is centered outside of the United States. If you look at the share of global soybean demand that resides in international markets, it's around 85% globally. And then if we look just specifically at what the US produces and what we put into international market channels, roughly 60% of total US soybean production here, whether it's exported as a whole bean or as the co-products of soybean meal and soybean oil, 60% of the complex thereabout in any given marketing year is ultimately finding its way into international channels. Now, to provide a little bit additional context there in terms of the geographic dispersion and just how integrated the global trading system is and how important it is for the US soy industry, I'd like to just pivot over to the next slide here, and actually a series of slides. So one, this is how we, over the past 5 years, soybean oil, as it's gone around the world, you see a tremendous diversity of markets here. Soybean meal, on the next slide, actually covers an even wider swath. And then the whole soybean, the final slide here, covering markets all over the world. And it's both developing markets where there's a tremendous amount of demographic shift where people are consuming more and more protein and need the raw soybean meal to serve as an input into domestic animal agriculture. So we look at places like Southeast Asia, China, certainly, emerging markets in North Africa. We're also serving, Europe and developed markets as well. Our two biggest markets for soybean, for whole soybeans are China and the European Union. So one of the things that is absolutely critical for us both in marketing promotion of US soy globally is product differentiation. And we always operate from the standpoint of we're not just a reliable supplier, period. We are a reliable supplier of choice. And I think one through line that has come through in the previous points laid out by both Rory and Bill is that customer choice is really paramount here. And as we see an evolution over time, it's not just traditional differentiators that matter. US soy has always been a fantastic product to deliver both for domestic markets and internationally on the simple merits of what composes the bean and the meal and oil that come from it. We've been able to compete on on nutritional quality, on high amino acid profile, protein profile, vitamins and minerals. These are all things that are demanded by our customers globally. But now, sustainability is naturally becoming a much more important differentiating factor. And ultimately, we think it's a good thing. It's a point that in part enables US soy to further differentiate itself, not just in terms of product profile, but the whole set of practices that go into making that happen. US soy farmers are incredibly innovative and always have been. They've been adopters of newer and newer technology, newer practices, and the combination of new technological advancements coupled with new agronomic practices and emerging of agronomic practices allow for increased adoption of sustainable practices. This can be things like adopting conventional tillage, minimizing carbon emissions that traditionally can arise from production agriculture. It's looking at crop rotation. It's looking at cover crops. And I think it also bears note that, just the physiological nature of a soybean itself allows for nitrogen fixing in the soil. So, it fundamentally is a sustainably oriented crop here. Now, all those practices are fantastic, and we want to continue to, promote not that just that U.S. soybean farmers are doing that, but that it carries through to the whole end market here. So, over the past couple of years, the U.S. soy industry has worked together, sort of a joint task force, multi-stakeholder group, comprised of consumers around the world, NGOs, and farmers to jointly develop an independently audited program called the U.S. Soy Sustainability Assurance Protocol, or SSAP. So it's an aggregated approach that is administered by third parties to verify sustainable soybean production practices at a national scale. And that really is defined under 4 pillars here. So sustainable practices as they pertain to the U.S. soy industry are biodiversity, encouraging biodiversity, overall sustainable production practices like the aforementioned crop rotation, adoption of cover crops, conservation tillage, public and labor health, and of course, and I think this is very, very important, continuous improvement of practices. I think as Bill had alluded in his presentation here, where we are at one point in time, our opinions or views, as he had mentioned, his views on the Seattle round of the WTO talks, it's continually emerging over time. It's continually evolving. So we want to make sure that we're also evolving how we are regarding practices and making sure that we that our farmers are always going to be effective stewards of the land, which they are, and always looking for new innovations to help bring there. The other point that I want to bring out here, and I think this has also come out very strongly in the prior 2 presentations, is just the need for transparency and harmonization. We work in a commoditized field here in the world of soybeans, but when we look at international trade, certainly being able to assure that we are all operating, be it suppliers and destinations, on a uniform understanding of what the production practices are that go into creating the product that is bought and sold internationally. But also just making sure that there's appropriate amount of discovery and information that happens. And I think this SSAP program that we have in place is one of the things that really does help differentiate and create a nice hallmark of sound practices, and allows our customers to continue to see what we're doing as an industry and how it fits into the global scheme here. So I want to make sure that we have ample time for conversation. Certainly it's an evolving environment. When you consider some of the US-China trade dynamics that have emerged over the past couple of years, it's naturally, soybeans have been at the heart of that. And I think rather than provide some prepared comments on that, I'd welcome questions around that and the industry more broadly. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Urban, and look forward to questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. That was very interesting. And I'm sure you'll get some interesting questions. So I'm going to start by directing one question each to the panelists in the order in which they spoke. So starting with Rory, we had a question from the audience, Rory, that started by congratulating your company on taking the stance that it has taken, and immediately went to the bottom line. So what is this going to mean for your gross margin, the questioner asked, and how long can you go without pricing these changes into your products?
Yeah, that is right. Going to the point, I guess the easy answer would be stay tuned for our next quarterly earnings report. But I mean, sure. But I guess the point is we're constantly adding attributes to products. All companies do this. It's critical to your success. You have to innovate. You build in a new value proposition. We did that, as I said, with Raised Without Antibiotics. And yes, took on a level of cost, took some impact to gross margin, I suppose, but we managed over time to gain some market share and actually add some premium pricing. So I think that's true. As you continue to differentiate your products, we don't have the luxury of tremendous, commodity cost competitiveness in many ways. We have to differentiate in Canada. We're a high cost jurisdiction. And adding carbon cost, just kind of continues a trend. But, we also believe, though, I think you can often find, when you adopt a mindset of sustainability, it's quite amazing. And that would include, for example, around, say, carbon and manure management. Well, you start to think about how you could drive some opportunity, but at the same time, you discover you're actually eliminating some costs. Like you embed certain costs in traditional practices, in your plant, in your farm. And it's only when somebody tells you you've got to reach to a higher standard, you start to do that. And next thing you know, there are, like I say, those co-benefits of some related cost reductions or other benefits in your yields or in your feed efficiency and things like that. So I'm quite convinced there's lots of space for that cost reduction co-benefit as we drive this. And as I said, ultimately, if we can get to a place, say, where we can capture methane from hog manure more efficiently, we can create biogas. We've now got a renewable, potentially lower cost source of gas that we can use. We can earn credits, offset credits that might be sold or applied against compliance obligations, and just generally move forward. At some point, maybe finally, yes, we will be pricing. I don't know, but we're gonna establish the position, and then you can see now, I don't know, for example, Budweiser, I believe, has got a sort of a carbon neutral positioning on some of their beer products. I don't know if they've yet reflected a price on that, but these things are happening, and I think there's a commercial upside over time.
Thank you. Bill, I'd like to ask you the China question. You mentioned China several times. First of all, you alluded to, in one of your 4 reasons why things have changed, you alluded to countries with growing middle classes that are demanding more environmental protection, and I assume China was one of those countries. You talked about the Chinese experience with Peru and that trade agreement, and you mentioned that China has trade agreements with Chile and Switzerland, and it's about the Chile and Switzerland agreements that I'd like to ask you. Could you compare the provisions in those with what you told us about TPP, and the USMCA, and can you talk about whether they've really had a real world impact?
Well, I can answer that question really simply. Can I compare those? And I can say no, because I'm not I'm not as familiar with them as I am TPP and the North American Free Trade Agreement revisions. But I am kind of thinking about taking this little talk and putting it into a paper. And if I do, I'm going to dig into both of those because I want to see exactly how meaningful they were. I've got to believe that it was Chile and Switzerland who drove the need to put those chapters in there. We need to see what China agreed to, because I think that's going to be important. And then we need to kind of actually follow up and look and see whether or not China has changed their behavior at all because of those, which I would bet they haven't. Getting China's compliance with WTO standards, even with the existing WTO obligations, is difficult enough. I think that they would find any inclusion of environmental measures within the WTO to be an infringement on their national sovereignty, which is why we've got to, now that China is in the WTO, I think we've got to figure out a way that we can move forward on these issues without them. On the other hand, moving forward on an issue like climate change without China is not setting oneself up for success.
Okay, thank you. Mac, you talked about the SSAP, and I have a couple of questions for you about that. One is, you talked about how it evaluates the conservation practices, including cover crops and crop rotation and conservation tillage. Can you give us, first of all, some estimate of how many soybean producers or what percentage of the acreage of soybean production in the US comply with those standards? And secondly, can you talk about what kind of active interest you've gotten from customers in digging into those? How important do you think those standards have proven to economic success in selling soybeans abroad?
Both fantastic questions, Urban. So the first part is, if we look at the whole landscape of U.S. soy production and what's being administered through third-party audit conducted by the USDA, about 95% of U.S. Soy farmers are compliant in this U.S. farm program that allows for SSAP. So a pretty substantial share of what is actually cultivated in the U.S. is compliant with this, which I think becomes a tremendous differentiating factor, particularly when you're dealing in a commodity market. If we look at some of the evolving dynamics and preferences that are happening on the international customer side, I'll just use Europe as one example here. So if you take the emergence of provisions in the Green Deal, particularly with its, zero deforestation and looking at, carbon neutral supply chains, being able to have that, third party identified demarcation point of sustainable practices that are mitigating carbon emissions, I think becomes a really critical differentiating factor and speaks to one of the customer demands that's happening in a very material market. The other thing is we've actually been working through our Soybean Export Council, which is part of the broader U.S. soy industry here, and I actually shared duties with USEC as well. One of the things that's been worked on recently is working with a couple major exporters for certification for U.S. Produced soy oil that fits in well with the renewable energy protocols in the European Union. So that's been a nice benefit as well. Obviously not on the food side, but certainly getting into sustainable practices and that are going to be environmentally beneficial on the biofuel side as well. So it's a good differentiator there. Unfortunately, we have a very substantial share of U.S. soy that falls under this umbrella.
Thank you. We have a question, or actually a couple of questions asked from a producer perspective. So these questions are directed at any of the panelists. First one is, how can we continue to progress on sustainability outcomes in agriculture and food while minimizing the administrative burden on farmers?
I think this is a great question, and I'm going to maybe go between some of my perspective from my time in industry and perspective from my time now at USB. I think one of the things that's really exciting about the field of agriculture in general, and really if you look at the level of investment that's happened from not just major companies but startups over the past 5, 6, 7 years, is as there's been more and more appreciation for the criticality of agriculture in terms of meeting customer demands and seeking fluidity throughout supply chains. Is that there's more and more entrants that come in and come up with new technologies that might be low barrier to entry, such as digital agriculture. And I think if you look at some of the tools that are being created, a lot of that is being driven towards allowing for increased transparency, decreased administration costs. And I like to think that, as we have this overall ecosystem of innovation, it drives down, cost burden, both in terms of a financial standpoint, but also, just administrative compliance here. Naturally, I think we've still got a hurdle to clear in terms of being able to bring not just harmonization and transparency around, the true cost of carbon, what that means. But looking at that, I think, is a nice vehicle for farmers to get credit for, sound practices that they're already adopting, so that, we can switch things from agriculture being a net emitter to ultimately a carbon sink through sound practices. But naturally, that's going to require, I think, continued technological innovation that allows for lower compliance burden, as well as being able to unlock those pools of value that will be societally beneficial, ecologically beneficial, and provide some value creation for farmers as well.
Would either of the other panelists like to weigh in?
Yeah, Urban, I think this is a good argument for increased international harmonization on the regulation side and in dealing with some of these sustainability and environmental issues. Because if you have every country going off on their own and setting up their own documentation requirements and their own tracking procedures, it's only going to increase the burden on producers who do produce a commodity that's traded internationally. And the more that you can harmonize those requirements, the less of a burden there's actually going to be on any one producer.
Great. Rory?
Yeah, I absolutely. That issue of interjurisdictional friction, disconnection, again, maybe one thing for a farmer that's operating in one jurisdiction, but think about the company like ours or others that are trying to run their business across multiple national and subnational jurisdictions where the compliance and the reporting and the obligations are all different. I guess, though, a couple points I'll make. One, if we're just focusing on carbon, for example, that's why, to me, carbon pricing made so much sense, right? Because it's embedding market signals into your choices of fuels, of utilization. Like it inherently drives, like in our case, it has driven an internal price on carbon that now becomes associated with every capital investment decision and so on. And it's not about asking a bunch of regulatory compliance questions. It just now becomes part of the business model and the decision making. So to me, that's the whole reason to price carbon, as opposed to trying to regulate emissions at every level and in all different sorts of ways. But the one challenge that I do see in this is, while we want to harmonize, standardize, simplify, of course, the truth is that the carbon or the environmental impact of farm A in jurisdiction A or in, that particular location is not necessarily the same as the equivalent farm producing the same volume in it. Like, it's all very ecosystem related, and the impact of one farm on the biodiversity, it depends on the soil, the water, the issue. So that whole issue of how you set standards that are harmonized and simple, but are actually real in the context in which a given operator is, environmentally, and the auditing that might have to go against that, tricky. The one thing I'll note on technology, I mentioned Teraton. So again, if I understand their approach, like they're signing up farmers to farm carbon, right? But the way they validate the carbon reduction by soil sampling and so on, it's highly digital. They're using satellite technology. They're using a number of ways so that it's not like the farmer has to directly visit and fill out a checklist all the time. Like, they've got on-site or digital or satellite-based methods of capturing information. So I think there's a number of tools like that that are going to evolve.
Interesting, thank you. The second question from a farmer perspective that was asked had to do whether, is there any way we can get our trade agreements to give farmers a premium price for their sustainability efforts? The silence is deafening.
Go, Bill.
I don't think you want to. I don't think you want to start injecting pricing into trade agreements. That's going to have to be, as the other panelists have said, it's got to be a reaction to the market and market forces. I mean, Mac, what I mean, or Rory.
Yeah, I think we're all in alignment here that, you know, market signals and dynamics are really going to be the drivers of the most efficient outcome and allocation, and how price manifests itself as a result of that. You know, I'll also say it's not the purview of my organization to opine on trade policy writ large here. So, you know, I think adopting a market-based approach is definitely most appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I would just point out again, like in our model, we have found a way, our contract producers that raise animals without antibiotics receive a premium, right? They are earning value. They're incurring some additional cost, but we're more than rewarding that additional cost through a premium. Now, that's one attribute in production that, you know, there's obviously potentially many others. We've found the financial model for that. Will we get to a place where, like I say, we're already seeing carbon mitigation being rewarded through programs that are commercially driven entirely. So, you know, I think all these things will evolve over time, and best that we let the market, because I guess there is also, of course, at least in Canada and Europe, in some countries, the idea of actually paying farmers for environmental goods and services, right? The idea that they invest in things that the market doesn't reward in terms of conservation and so on, where there are some of those programs in Canada where farmers can sign up and get payments for protecting wetlands and things like that. I think there's programs also like where Ducks Unlimited and so on are actually compensating farmers that will do that sort of thing. So there are those mechanisms as well. They're not directly related to getting a higher commodity price, but net they contribute to farm income. So I think there's lots of scope to develop those ideas.
Yeah, thank you, Rory. And you made an interesting point there, which is that this is not all about trade agreements. There's other things driving this. And in your remarks, you mentioned the role of Walmarts and others in kind of setting standards that you know, we're going to be driving sustainability outcomes. And I wonder if you could talk about that in a little more detail and how that has affected your company. Are you working with any of these, you know, retailers on things, and how does that work for you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, yes. In fact, I don't know of any global large-scale retail operator, be it Canada, US, or globally. Like, I think all of them have, at this point, placed on their vendor community some level of expectation about not necessarily absolute commitments, but a transparency, a reporting, you know, the idea that they want to see from every vendor a sustainability plan and what they're doing, and a willingness to report on that. That's been the case, I think, for, you know, a few years now. I guess the question is, though, at what point do you start to see very biting obligations from your customer in terms of your practices? You know, we certainly have those now, again, with respect to our food safety commitments. We have it in many ways around animal care, and get, you know, literally the customer auditing our operations to ensure we're meeting their standards of animal care. So I think this is evolving, and there's probably already, you know, some examples where there are hard and fast rules. Some of those retail or food service chains, of course, adopt very clear consumer positioning related to sustainability, and they will only work with vendors, right, that meet those standards. So yeah, it's happening. It's certainly true in the meat world and in the plant protein world.
Great. I have a question that either Bill or Rory, maybe both, might want to tackle, and that is, it asks for a comparison between the new Nafta, USMCA, and its environmental provisions, and the trade agreement between Canada and Europe, the CETA, and that environmental chapter. Are the environmental provisions in those two agreements roughly similar or very different? Could either of you talk to that?
Bill, maybe you would know.
Actually, I was about to say, Rory, maybe you should answer.
Yeah. Well, I should know, honestly, I know a number of things
too.
about the CETA agreement between Canada and the EU, but I'm sure there's a high quality environmental chapter, but honestly, I have not dug into that. It hasn't come to bear in terms of any of we don't do a lot of business with Europe, frankly. So I can't really say. I know in the case of NAFTA previously and going forward, that issue is very relevant because there's so many standards issues that, and it's not just the trade agreement itself. It's like in the case of Canada, yes, we have a regulatory cooperation agreement and having an ongoing, and that actually has been institutionalized, if you will, or recognized in the trade agreement. Back to your point, Bill, about governance. It's as important as anything, not just the rules as you might write them today. It's the governance and the process by which you engage on science, on standards, because the ground is shifting, expectations are rising, and what's so important is to have a mechanism that doesn't just stay static and can embrace change and commercial opportunity as it emerges.
Great, thanks. Bill, a question for you. So you talked about how in the new USMCA, as in TPP, there is a quote unquote standstill provision that promises that the signatory won't roll back environmental standards. I want to put you on the spot on that with regard to the United States. There has been a lot of undoing of environmental standards under the Trump administration. And I'm wondering whether you think that the U.S., whether Canada would have a right, or Mexico would have a right to complain about the U.S. Doing that.
No, I don't think so. You can revise your environmental regulations, and national legislatures and administrations have the right to adjust their environmental provisions, but they can't do so in a way that is designed to give them a competitive advantage on trade or production. And so if it were seen that we were changing our environmental regulations, maybe let's say wetlands, I'm just making up an example, but if we were changing our wetlands policy in a way that would allow us to put more acreage into production, well then, and that was the intent of doing it, well then maybe there would be a legitimate claim. But if you're changing your mining regulations and it has nothing to do with trying to secure any trade advantage, I think that would be within a country's sovereign right to do it. So it's not that you can't adjust it, but you can't roll back in a way that creates a competitive advantage for your producers.
Great, thank you.
The one thing I might just say on that, Urban, is what we do see, and it's true in Canada as well, but particularly when a state government, I'm thinking California, Proposition 65, you know, this kind of thing, where a standard is set higher by a given state, obviously that is a barrier to internal trade in the US, and then you get into all these ongoing legal challenges, but then it directly will impact, of course, the third country. And then it's a question, is the US violating a trade obligation by raising a standard or whatever, or a state level measure? So unfortunately, there's too much of that in North America, in my view. Like I think at the end of the day, administrations come and go. We have in North America very high expectations and standards of environmental protection generally. In fact, you could say, yes, the Trump administration has reduced certain protections, but there's a lot of states and even municipal governments that are taking a different approach. All of this continues to kind of raise the bar and the expectation, which is good. I guess my concern, back to kind of the Chinas, the countries that are truly not in sync with marrying trade with high levels of environmental protection and potentially are backsliding. I think Canada and the US and North America should be united based on our strong standards in NAFTA to work together in the global multilateral context to deal with the countries that are not perhaps as progressive.
Thanks. I'm not going to give you a rest, Rory. I've got another question for you. This question is, how prepared is Canadian industry to meet the demands of consumers in Europe outlined in the recent Green Deal. Many eco schemes under consideration, this person says.
Yeah, well, challenging for sure. Obviously, we have a strong trade relationship with Europe, but there's that whole history of whether it's hormones in beef or biotech, GMOs. Like there's so many examples, unfortunately, where European standards, in our view, have not fully reflected good science or have been offside WTO obligations. We're obviously hoping we're not going to see more of that. But I guess, again, from a commercial point of view, if the old mantra, the customer is always right. If Europe is going to move to higher expectations and requirements based on particularly the private sector standards, we've seen that in animal care, a number of things. I guess Canada is relatively well positioned to take advantage of that. Again, think of carbon. Europe is pricing carbon, right? Canada is pricing carbon. Like there's a natural then potential ability, I would think, to reflect that in the way we recognize and meanwhile avoid protectionism, because we're going to agree to embed the price of carbon in traded goods. That's a good thing. I guess what we don't want, or the big issue, is border tax adjustments, right? Where at some point, we talked about that earlier, does Europe say, well, we've got this standard of sustainability based on our Green Deal and so on, we're going to start to try to impose border tax adjustments because we're not going to accept imports from jurisdictions with lesser standards. That would be a backward step, right? Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Good.
Well, and that is the real risk of not having any sort of mechanism within trade agreements to deal with some of these evolving issues, because
Right.
we see it right now with the European Union. The European Union is moving forward very rapidly to remove a number of chemicals from their registration lists, prohibiting the use of these chemicals anymore in Europe for what they would argue are sustainability or environmental reasons. They are not consistent with international standards. They've come to conclusions that are very different from a lot of the international evaluations. I would argue that what they are doing contravenes their obligations under the existing Uruguay round SPS agreement. But that aside, if they want to remove those chemicals and not allow their producers to use them, that's their right. But if they then begin to prohibit the introduction or the importation of products that have used those chemicals abroad, now they're exporting their environmental policies to third countries. And we don't have a good mechanism for dealing with that in the WTO. And that's why I'm trying to argue this core could be a way to deal with them, because the only thing we do is we end up back with like a turtle, dolphin, tuna case, and we beat each other up as we did with beef hormones. And after 8 years, we still don't have a conclusion. And issues are moving much too rapidly to wait 8 to 10 years and still not have a resolution to the problem.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. As a journalist, I have been taught not to ask questions that I don't understand, but I'm going to violate that rule because we have a question from the audience that I find very intriguing, even though I don't fully understand. And so because I don't fully understand, you're going to bear with me, I'm going to read it. It's fairly long. Have Maple Leaf or Bryant Christie Inc. considered the idea of bioregional governance and how this approach might facilitate the solutions you speak of today? Bioregional governance would address core environmental systems directly without the need to consult politically driven trade. This approach would allow for entire watersheds, food sheds, and fiber sheds to be governed in a way that makes most sense for the resources and people within those bioregions. Bioregional governance also addresses racial issues that have been in existence for centuries, but are at the forefront of the present day environmental related topics. How can we work together? How would bioregional governance affect your goals?
Yeah, well, I'll start. It's a good question. And it is that tension between globalization versus localization, and how I raised the point earlier, every ecosystem is different. Every watershed is different, both in terms, the risks, the biodiversity. I mean, we already embrace the concept. I could say, the Arctic Council takes care from an intergovernmental basis on a regional basis, managing the Arctic environment. In Canada, we have regional conservation authorities that are very much centered around watersheds and how do you adopt standards and practices of land use that are appropriate to a given watershed. So absolutely, that is all really critical. I don't know, I guess I'm pragmatic in saying we need all solutions. Some of them are global, some of them are national, some of them are subnational, some will be regional. Like you need all the tools in the toolkit, I would say. And you have to have a lot of transparency and science, right, to be the grounding of it all. I don't think we could ever, you know, is it realistic to kind of remove the politics, more or less say, you know, we're going to take municipal governments out of the equation around how you might manage land use in a given ecoregion because, you know, the mayors and those municipalities aren't scientists? Well, I don't know. I'm not ready to go there. I think elected officials have to play a key role in balancing and making difficult judgments about economics, science, environmental protection. And we just need, you know, inclusive, consultative, science-based processes to ensure that, you know, there's a fair representation of voices and management that is effective, like I say, at that local level.
Thanks. Question, new plant breeding technologies like CRISPR have tremendous potential for increasing sustainability, but governments like the EU are not embracing this new technology. Can trade negotiations open minds around new technologies?
Definitely. And frankly, we made huge strides forward in the Uruguay round in the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement in doing that. If the European Union simply abided by their obligations under the SPS agreement, we wouldn't have as many difficulties introducing emerging technologies, but they don't. And so they are not making decisions based on, in my opinion, they are not always making policy decisions based on risk assessments. If you make a policy decision based on an objective risk assessment, you can deal with emerging technologies, whether it's genetic engineering or the introduction of new plant breeding techniques.
Others on the panel want to talk to that? Mac?
Yeah, I think just as a blanket statement here, you know, representing the interests of farmers, you know, we have enough challenging environments overall when it comes to, you know, effectively being price takers and in any given year through weather or you know, trade disputes or other things that can compress margins. So I just, you know, as a blanket statement, I want to say I want to keep the toolbox as open as possible, and certainly the applications of new breeding techniques, including CRISPR, gene editing writ large. These are, you know, certainly evolving technologies that we want to make sure that we have, you know, the full suite of application and availability on, so that we can, you know, harness them to their full potential. I think that's an important evolving technology to come back to farmers. But I also think that, you know, as we think about new technologies, and certainly CRISPR is one that's been on, you know, everybody's lips for the past couple of years, it's not just about this technological platform. It's about, I think, establishing a paradigm that allows for a broader understanding of technology and an appreciation for the science that underpins it, so that we're not hamstringing the availability of farmers' access to a critical technology that can continue to advance efficiency and, by extension, you know, environmental sustainability.
Rory?
The comment I would add too here that's important to me is the strength of the intellectual property provisions in trade agreements, right? And so where there's a lot of benefit by standardizing rights and obligations related to this, because that, of course, underpins the risk-taking that inventors are willing to take, knowing that they can earn the reward from the invention and that it won't be, that intellectual property won't be violated, and they can confidently sell the product internationally and have that respected. So I'm sure there's a whole other topic around the adequacy of IP protection as it relates to innovation in agri-food, and you get into all those issues of you know, seed production technologies and so on, plant breeders' rights, all of that. But those international mechanisms, to me, are really critical, just as they are for food safety or any of the other, risk factors in agri-food that we've talked about.
Thanks. Question is, could you speak to social sustainability efforts? The questioner says, COVID-19 has highlighted the conditions farm workers are subjected to, including low wages, long hours, lack of healthcare and sick leave, et cetera. How, if at all, are these issues driving your organizations?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd be happy to start on that. Great question, because so often it feels like we immediately, in these issues of sustainability, focus quickly on the environmental issues. So important. But sustainability is about sustainability of the environment, of the economic model of, that we've got, and social society. So for us, that idea of sustainable communities and participating in the sustainability of the communities where particularly we operate, where our employees live, and in the markets that we serve is hugely important. In our case, as I mentioned earlier, it's more than philanthropy. It has to be focused on real engagement and listening and investing in infrastructure and solutions. In our case, we focus that very much on food security, because there's just far too much food insecurity in North America for wealthy countries. It's wrong, and we are committed not just to philanthropic donations of surplus food or food bank donations. We've created at Maple Leaf a foundation or a Center for Action on Food Security, where we're committing pre-tax profit to a foundation to give grants for models of structural improvement in food security, and trying to empower NGOs to solve problems that are not well solved now. So totally agree. I'm not sure I could relate that right away to the COVID issue, but there's an example where we know our workplaces are part of a community, and we have to be collaborating with our public health leaders in the community if we want our workplace to be safe, and vice versa. If our workplace isn't safe, it's putting at risk the community. So, we have to do it jointly.
Yeah, on that, if I think back 4 months ago in the US, when we first started to see at least state level lockdowns that were happening, and I think temporary shuttering of some businesses, one of the first lines of essential designation that occurred was ensuring that people who were involved in the whole agricultural value chain, be it from on-farm production all the way through the retail channel, was designated as essential economic and workplace activity, which is on the surface, I think a good thing for ensuring that we have continuity of supply, and obviously food is a critical piece of infrastructure here. But what can't be lost in that is, I think, some of the hidden social and mental costs that come with that essential designation. So, which is why USB and other farm groups have worked together to promote mental health resource issues, particularly navigating farm stress and producer stress, generally, but I think much more acutely in this time of COVID here. So the point is very well taken. When we think about social license, when we think about social sustainability, we're certainly seeing a lot more pressure on that now, when you have these completely exogenous, heretofore unseen events happen like COVID. And I think just underscores how we have to keep them being part of the conversation, keep addressing them, and ensuring that everybody who is involved in that kind of essential workspace here has the resources and outlets necessary to maintain overall health, be it both physical and mental.
Bill, do you want to speak to that one?
I don't really have anything to add to what was already. Yeah.
Okay. We have a couple of questions about developing countries. One of the questioners says, the speakers are all from developed countries. And uh, both questions sort of point out the limitations of the ability of developing countries to meet some of the standards. One of the questioners asks, is there a risk of agreeing to the lowest common denominator? Bill, I think you, with your concentric circles, may have addressed that already to some extent, but maybe you'd like to elaborate in conjunction with that question.
Yeah, going back to the whole situation we were in Seattle in 1999, this was a huge issue. Whether or not environment should be included in what would be contemplated in a new round of trade agreements was a major point of contention. You had environmental communities around the planet really pushing for it, but you had a lot of national governments saying that they simply did not have the technical capacity, one, to negotiate it, or two, to probably implement whatever would end up being negotiated. And they didn't want to go there. I don't think that is the case 2 decades later. I mean, there are still many countries that do not have the technical capacity to negotiate a broad environmental agreement, and certainly maybe not the capacity to consistently implement those regulations internally, but there are a lot who do. And there is, because of the rise of middle class over the last few decades, there is more demand in many of these countries to do that. And there is now much more technical assistance available to countries who want to implement sustainable practices within their countries and implement domestic legislation that didn't exist before. So if there's a developing country that is sincerely interested in beginning to implement more rigorous sustainability practices internally, there is technical capacity building available to them that wasn't available 2 decades ago, and there's much more interest in doing that. So, and you see that, and it's not just the United States and developed countries that are negotiating these agreements. I mean, you have communities in many developing countries that are pressing their governments to include environmental provisions in the new trade agreements. So I think we're in a very different environment than we were even a decade ago.
Either of the
I
other
would just
panelists?
add to that, I think Bill's really point, and he made the point earlier, of course, the basic notion of global trade as an enabler of advancing wealth and prosperity in the developing world is, to me, without question. It's proven a fact. And as these countries gain wealth, they rise in their expectations for health and safety and environmental protection. And so there's that side of it. The other piece in terms of that sort of risk of race to the bottom, if you will, and again, I think Bill made the point, like if you look at the WTO agreements today, so in SPS, it's not like it's a group of ministers of trade from the countries all sitting at the table and deciding, okay, we're going to go for this SPS standard under, a very political kind of perspective. They've essentially outsourced it to the Codex, to the OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health. Like, yes, those are intergovernmental bodies. Yes, there's a fair big degree of politics and positioning in the decision-making of those groups, but at their core, they're science-based. You could say in labor, the ILO, like, these are groups that are better, have the competencies, have the secretariats and resources to, I think, create standards based on best practice and so on, that then become the threshold for adjudicating trade disputes under the WTO. So I don't think you could argue that we're in a world of lesser food safety because we've now, embedded food safety in a trade agreement. I think quite the opposite. And I think we can do that in many more areas of sustainability, as in fact, as Bill pointed out.
Okay. I have a big question for you from the audience. If a global climate agreement with China seems unlikely, but a near global climate agreement without China would be ineffective, what is the path ahead?
Whoa. Yeah.
Yeah. The fact that we cannot get the perfect and have to settle for the good should not keep us from moving forward with the good. And maybe China eventually, and not just China, we pick on China, but there's a lot of other countries that are perfectly happy to have China take the lead, but are not any more interested in negotiating an agreement than China is. I do think that if you had the NAFTA countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, in lockstep with the European Union and many of the TPP countries, we would establish a foundation upon which to move forward. There would be enough production capacity included in the agreement that we wouldn't necessarily be putting ourselves at a real competitive disadvantage in many commodities. And we should pursue that and hope that in time, other countries that want to move forward with that and join the agreement could. We got to structure it in a way, though, that there's an incentive for countries to be included in that, so that their and that their producers are not going to be at a competitive disadvantage, and that's going to be a very difficult thing to do. But just because it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't get started.
Yeah, I think 2 points I just want to draw out of Bill's comments that I found myself nodding vigorously with. And one, the first is we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You know, I think there are still things that can happen both through bilateral and multilateral cooperation and as individual countries that can, you know, help promote climate mitigation measures. So even if China's not in the fold here, there's still things that can be done, you know, on an individual country level through various channels. And that's one of the things that I think is most exciting about operating in the world of agriculture is that we can, you know, through promoting the right practices, and some of that is definitely come through market signals. And that's the second point of Bill's that I wanted to draw out is that, you know, we have to have the appropriate market signals in place. You know, that will allow for, you know, kind of flipping the paradigm on its head and, you know, driving production agriculture to be, you know, more of a net carbon sink than an emitter. And that's certainly going to be beneficial. If we have, you know, any of, you know, the large producers here that are working towards that aim, that's certainly going to be a better environment than we're looking at, you know, at present, independent of China's involvement.
The only other point I would add, I agree absolutely with those points. The one further thought too is I don't think, and I'm certainly no expert, but we shouldn't discount, despite China's positioning on these issues, perhaps in some of the, or the US in international or global fora, the fact is there's a lot of progress on the ground, right? Like I hear things happening in China around adoption of solar, for example, and conversion to clean energy and things that are ahead of North America or Europe in some areas, right? So again, an open economy tends to take on new technology based on consumer and customer demands, and I think that is being reflected in the way China is. And because they've got such tremendous financial resources, you know, they're spending in some areas of infrastructure on a big scale that is, I think you could say, green infrastructure that we can only envy here in North America because we're living with an infrastructure legacy that's very old and based on old technology, right? So they're able to move forward faster in some ways than we can.
We're getting near the end here, but I'm going to take two more questions. And one of them is, from a pricing and supply chain standpoint, the questioner asks, what is the role of exchanges to enable sustainable commodities? He elaborates, no longer is it simply a number one or a number two for corn or beans, but perhaps differentiated new grades or a standalone sustainable exchange that would allow the producer to price in the higher costs. Could anybody talk to whether they think that that might be a way forward for achieving more sustainable production?
Yeah, I'll kick that off. You know, I think if you look at the global you know, ag commodity trade environment where you have, you know, an intricate system of handlers and traders, you know, working together to fulfill orders, you know, there's still ample room for things that go beyond the commodity specification. You know, if we're looking at, you know, non-GM channels, for example. I think what's you know, necessary even beyond exchanges is you know, just the technological infrastructure that can be in place to maintain identity preservation and you know, fully kind of you know, isolate and identity preserve you know, those differentiated channels where there might be a little bit more of a price premium, and part of that price premium might come back to you know, having you know, differentiated practices that may or may not be more sustainable there. So I think, certainly exchanges, be it, facilitating physical exchange of a differentiated commodity, or just an information exchange that allows for a full flow of buyer and seller specifications is certainly an essential piece here. But, as long as we can have those identity preserved channels in place, that's part of what allows for that premium to flow back through the whole value chain.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I guess the one thought I have, that absolutely, I was going to raise the identity preservation issue as a real key enabler of the differentiation that should allow for premiums. I would make a comment about regulation generally. In my experience, too often, whether it's, say, regulation of seed varieties, or regulation of standards of production in animal agriculture, or what have you, typically they move slowly, right? Governments impose a certain regime of regulation to protect quality, safety, and so on. But those same regulations 10, 20 years later can become a barrier to innovation. And I think that is increasingly the case with some advances in sustainability. I'll give you just one example. It hasn't really yet started to bite, but I can see it coming. Well, you've seen it in the case of GMO labeling, and how do you reconcile the science with the notion that we're going to regulate what's GMO or not, or whether a product is GMO free or not. In the case of carbon, we're already kind of in this situation. I mentioned earlier carbon labeling of food. Well, are we going to insist that to label a given food item as carbon neutral, that the actual production of that item from that factory or from that co-manufacturer, like how far do you go? Or is it sufficient to say, well, it's produced under the brand and under the ownership of one company that at a macro level can establish its carbon neutrality, even if that given product may not be carbon neutral in the narrowest sense. But if you don't allow some form of consumer communication, and if the current set of labeling regulations are going to be so restrictive as to say, well, that's false and misleading, well, now you've undermined a key commercial incentive for that company to go carbon neutral. So that whole, and therefore create a price premium for that, and hopefully pass that through the supply chain. So those regulatory barriers, I think, are very real, and we have to be thinking very creatively about how to adjust for that.
Great. Last question is about quote unquote border tax adjustments, import fees levied by carbon taxing countries on goods manufactured in non-carbon taxing countries. This questioner worries that the application of border tax adjustments would be captured by protectionists and used in a similar manner to anti-dumping cases to dissuade potential competitors from entering a market.
That is a very legitimate concern. And it's one that I have. The more that and it's a reservation I have in kind of moving in the direction I'm moving in, the more you embrace the melding of trade and environmental measures in the same agreement, the more vulnerable you are that environmental measures can be kidnapped by protectionist forces and used to restrict trade. And then you have a situation where you have not liberalized the trading system at all. You have not facilitated the movement of goods across borders, and you've probably got environmental measures that aren't really intended to do anything for the environment. And that's a lose-lose situation. So if the more that we begin to embrace the insertion of environmental language in trade agreements, the more we need to make sure that they are science-based, that there is transparency, and that there is a legitimate environmental objective. The more that we go off on our own ways, the more, I think, vulnerable we are to having environmental measures hijacked by protectionists, and the more likely we are to put our own competitors at a competitive, or our own producers at competitive disadvantages because of different pricing and taxing schemes.
Yeah. Thank you. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed today's session. Want to thank our panelists who've done a wonderful job, I think. I want to thank the Farm Foundation and CAPI, and I want to thank the audience for the wonderful questions, and I'd like to now turn it back to Shari for closing remarks.
Sure, thank you. So just before I conclude with my thank yous, I would begin with an invitation, and that would be an invitation to help us continue this discussion, to continue this dialogue. This actually concludes our 2-series session, but by no means is it the end. So we welcome your ideas, whether it's for collaboration around papers or further dialogue series, or speakers or other ways that we can collaborate. So please reach out with any ideas that you have for that. So I really thank you for joining us today for this discussion on trade and sustainability and looking at it through the 3 different lenses of our panelists with the private sector, policy, and commodity and producer lenses. I want to thank Urban for his shepherding us through the discussion as our moderator today, and to Rory, Bill, and Mac for your thoughtful contributions. Also, a special shout out to Don Buckingham, who has been a fabulous partner with us as CAPI's leader, and we look forward to further collaboration with Don. So with that, if there's nothing, I'm scanning everyone's faces to see if there's anything else anybody needs or wants to say. Otherwise, with that, we'll say so long and until next time. Thank you again.